Okay, so very good evening to all of you on behalf of the AOCN Web Academy. And today's topic is very niche, which is cranial nerve anatomy on MRI. And this is supposed to be a topic which is more relevant to adults, but of course, we do got some messages from pediatric neurologists also that we do need to look at the cranial nerves in children also. And mostly we are not looking at them because we are not really trained in that. So let us hope to hear from Yogeshwari today on this very important topic. And to chair this session, we have a very eminent pediatric neurologist and my dear friend, Dr. Jithangi Vanigasinghe, who is from Sri Lanka basically. She's done a fellowship from Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne, and she's was honorary consultant pediatric neurologist at Lady Ridgeway Hospital in Colombo. Presently, she's on a sabbatical in Brunei. And we all know her because of her landmark paper in West syndrome, which has established clearly, the role of oral steroids. It is in fact superior to ACTH in West syndrome, and that has been a great, leeway for us to actually give home-based therapy for so many of our West syndrome kids. I think the situation in Sri Lanka and India is almost the same regarding the neonatal hypoglycemic brain injury and asphyxia. So thank you, Jithangi, for that. And she's a keen researcher. She has received a NIH grant for a Baby Bravo project. She received Bernard D'Souza Award, which is, I think, the most prestigious award from Child Neurology Association of USA for outstanding research. And she is also, as I know personally, that she is ASEPA EEG Academy teacher as well, conducting EEG sessions all over Asia, as well as maybe outside Asia. And she has almost more than 75 publications. So welcome, Jithangi, to our session, and over to you.
Thank you, Kavita. Thank you so much. And also thank you to the AOCN. It's my privilege to chair this session, and good evening to everybody. And thank you for joining this session. And I think we are actually going to discuss something very important, although maybe not very often discussed. And I'm sure as pediatric neurologists and trainees, we see so many variations in anatomy of the cranial nerves, and also with involvement in relation to infection, inflammation, demyelination, and also trauma and tumors. Like, we all struggle really to find the localization and identify cranial nerves and their pathology. So I think it's a very niche area, but a very important topic that you have selected for today's talk. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Yogeshwari Deshmukh. I think those of you who joined last week, including myself, she gave a fantastic talk. So I'm actually looking forward to something even better today. So, but for those who were not there, let me introduce Dr. Yogeshwari. She's a consultant in neuroradiology at the Star Imaging and Research Center in Pune. So she has been an outstanding performer herself, obtaining the gold medal for the DNB radiology from PD Hinduja National Hospital and Research Center in Mumbai. And then she had obtained her DMRD from KEM Hospital in Mumbai. She's also done a fellowship in neuroradiology and head and neck imaging from MUSH. So she has several publications and has been a co-author in a chapter. So without further ado, I think over to you, Yogeshwari. We look forward to a very interesting talk. And just one reminder, please post your questions in the Q&A box so that we can take them up at the end of the lecture. So looking forward to a very interesting session. Thank you very much.
Jithangi, can you mute yourself?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Yogeshwari, you can start.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that kind introduction. All right. So today we are going to look at cranial nerve anatomy. Now, this is a very vast topic. There are 12 cranial nerves, and every cranial nerve has a lot of functions, lot of or different organs to be catered to. So it becomes really an extensive topic to be covered in just 40 minutes. What I'm going to do is I'm trying to cover whatever nerves possible. And we'll try to at least show you where exactly these nerves are to be seen on MRI. When we talk about radiology or per se imaging, there are 3 W's around which we revolve. First is where. Once you know the clinical scenario of a particular case, then you have to understand or expect or think that from which area are you suspecting the abnormality. So for that particular where, to answer that where, you have to have your anatomy in place. So suppose if you are having a third cranial nerve palsy, then you have to understand where exactly I'm supposed to look at so that I can pick up the abnormality. Now, once you localize from where it is coming, you have to know which sequence is going to show it the best, or or on which sequence you are supposed to see that nerve, because that makes a lot of difference. And once you have localized, once you have seen it and on that particular sequence which shows it the best, then you have to characterize a lesion which gives rise to your common pathologies that you expect in that area. As a radiologist, I think for a good radiology report, it is not only the radiologist who is important, but the protocol is also equally important. With the bad protocol, even if you give that study to best of the radiologists, he is not going to pick up the lesion. Why I'm saying so, the reason lies here. Now suppose this is these are the standard sequences that are taken in an orbit scan. If I tell you that this patient has a problem with the vision in his left eye, so can anyone pick up the obvious thing in these 4 images? If I'm talking about vision loss, that means I'm looking at the pathology of the optic nerves, right? So both looks quite symmetrical. I can't see much of signal abnormality in this area. So if somebody reports the scan, probably he'll report it as normal. But what you are supposed to look at, you have to take special sequences to identify these lesions. Now, in this case, if we take a 3D flare, normal routine flare, which has got 3 millimeters thickness or 4 millimeter thickness, you are likely to miss out the abnormality. Now, these 3D flare images, they are sub-millimeter in sections. So you can actually pick up thin cranial nerves abnormalities or pathologies on these sequences. So 3D flare image makes the lesion obvious. Now, this is the same patient, but if you look here, then you know that this portion of the nerve looks thick. Then there is one more sequence, which is called as the DIR, or double inversion recovery sequence. So on that sequence, now in here you cannot make out whether this is a nerve pathology or a nerve sheath pathology, but on this sequence you realize that the nerve per se is normal, but the sheath that it has is inflamed. Now this changes the whole diagnosis. On these images, I would have reported as normal. Only on these images, I would have probably reported as optic neuritis, but this sequence made a difference. Now the diagnosis becomes optic perineuritis. Now the treatment or differentials everything. Now this was the presenting symptom of a patient of sarcoidosis. So the underlying diagnosis was actually sarcoidosis, whereas the optic perineuritis was just one of the symptoms that patient had. So there lies the role of important sequences in any scan. So coming to the protocol of the cranial nerves. So these are the sequences that we take. With every cranial nerve, you will have some different protocol. You will have some different sequence added. We will come to this protocol a little later because I really want you to understand the significance of each and every sequence. So whenever you are getting the scans done in your radiology centers, you should be able to tell your radiologist that I want this sequence to be done in this patient, etc. All right. Now, coming to the cranial nerves. So we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So out of these, the true cranial nerves are 3rd to 12th. The first 2 olfactory and optic nerves, these are actually supposed to be the extension of CNS. What is the difference? Difference is the myelin coat that you have on these nerves is by oligodendrocytes, whereas the 3rd to 12th nerves, the myelin coat is by your Schwann cells. So we will first cover the olfactory nerve. Now, olfactory nerve gets the fibers from your nasal mucosa. They carry the sensation to the olfactory bulb. Now, though we call olfactory nerves routinely as this structure is called as olfactory nerves on imaging, but the olfactory nerves are actually these nerves. So these are the first order neurons. So they relay into the olfactory bulb. From there, the second order neurons go along the olfactory tract. So on this particular image, there is a anatomical landmark that I want to show. Now this olfactory nerve actually, now this is the undersurface of the brain. So we are actually seeing the brain from the down. So this lies over this sulcus. So that sulcus is called as the olfactory sulcus. Why it is important? Because in patients where you have olfactory nerve absent or agenesis of olfactory nerve or hypoplasia of the olfactory nerve, you will also see underdevelopment of this sulcus. And this could be one of the early signs to pick up on imaging that the olfactory sulcus is looking hypoplastic. That means olfactory nerve is probably hypoplastic. Now from here, the olfactory tract actually go into the basifrontal lobe. So on MR images, you can see it in sagittal section that the olfactory nerve part of the parts of it, we do not see it on MR, but the olfactory bulb and olfactory tracts are well seen on MRI. So they go to the basifrontal lobe. Now in the basifrontal lobe, what you have is this structure. So here, this cortex is called as the piriformis cortex. It has got a frontal lobe part as well as the temporal lobe part. So this piriformic, this is along the medial border of your temporal stem. So this is the temporal stem here. So the fibers go here, and then from piriform cortex, they actually get into the amygdala, then into the uncus, and then the perirhinal cortex. So this area here on actual images is actually your olfactory lobe or kind of entorhinal cortex. So or in epilepsy patients or wherever you hear this term as entorhinal cortex. So entorhinal cortex is actually part of your mesial temporal lobe. This is the temporal pole. So the medial part is your entorhinal cortex. This is just a rough guideline. So when you see the temporal horn, so anterior to the temporal horn, you are likely to see the entorhinal cortex. So this portion here is going to be the perirhinal and entorhinal cortex. I will not get into much details of that because that's not required. So the second order neurons not only go into this area, but some neurons go to thalamus. Then some neurons go to frontal lobe gyri. And that's why we have got a lot of areas getting the olfactory sensation from. So they are helpful to characterize or localize a lesion. If you are not finding a lesion in the optic nerve, probably the olfactory areas which may have been affected in a particular patient of anosmia. So you should just know where exactly these olfactory neurons can go. Then on MR, how will you identify? So they are best seen on coronals and sagittal sections. So on coronal sections, if you come anteriorly around this area, that is the posterior part of your globes, you will start seeing the optic nerves. And this portion here is actually your olfactory fossa. So this is a W-like structure that you see. This area here is the crista galli, and here there is attachment of your falx cerebri. And this gray structure here on each side are actually your olfactory bulbs. And when you start going posteriorly, you will go along the tracts, and these olfactory bulbs will lie below the olfactory sulcus. Now this medialmost gyrus here is called as the rectus gyrus, and this becomes your medial orbital gyrus. Between these is your olfactory sulcus. So it is named after this olfactory tract because olfactory, this is an anatomical localization for that nerve. All right. Now, as you can see, the olfactory tracts are quite close to your nasal cavity, nasal septum. So they are prone to trauma. Plus they are prone to nasal infections or nasal tumors. So whenever you have some nasal pathology, that's why you get the sensation of anosmia, because everything is, the main input of the olfactory nerve is blocked. In pediatric patients especially, you should be able to identify these olfactory nerves on coronal images. If a patient with hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism comes for evaluation, and if you see that the anterior pituitary gland is really hypoplastic, usually if the vertical height is less than 4 millimeters, we call it as a hypoplasia of the pituitary gland. In such cases, it is important to look for the olfactory bulbs, because if they are absent, as in this case, then that becomes the diagnosis, Kalman syndrome. So this is just one example of olfactory nerve pathology. Coming to the optic nerves. Now this lecture is more about anatomy, so I'm not going to show the spectrum of pathologies of each nerve. Whatever are more relevant, I'll try to show those pathologies. Coming to optic nerves. Now, we all know that optic nerves have got nasal fibers and temporal fibers. They get their input from retina. So they've traveled together through the optic nerve. The temporal fibers and the contralateral nasal fibers here, they become optic tract. So basically, this area where the nasal fibers are getting crossed is optic chiasm, optic tracts. Optic tract will relay in the lateral geniculate body, which is a part of your thalamus. And then from there, the optic radiation will go to the visual cortex. So this is the normal anatomy. Now, can we see everything on MR? Yes, we can. So optic nerve is basically this portion behind the globe. Optic nerve has been divided into 4 parts just for the simplification of anatomy, so that whenever there is a pathology, we should be able to describe precisely and everybody will be on the same anatomical note. So optic nerve is divided into 4 parts. One here is your intraocular part, which is within the globe. So whenever you have inflammation of this area, you call it papillitis. It will protrude into the globe, and that is the sign of papillitis on MRI. Again, if there is optic nerve edema, head edema, then you will see this pathology here. So basically, optic head is your intraocular part. This portion is your retrobulbar part, or also called as the intraorbital segment, which is within the orbit. Behind that, within the optic canal, becomes your intracanalicular portion within the canal. So on the medial side, you will have a sphenoid sinus. On the lateral side, you will have this clinoid process, anterior clinoid process. So the area between is the optic canal, and you have the intracanalicular segment. Now, from when it exits from the intracanalicular segment, it enters the cranial cavity. So this becomes your intracranial segment, which is also called as the prechiasmatic segment because it is in front of the chiasm. So this is your prechiasmatic segment. So this part is the optic nerve. Now here it is optic chiasm, and this portion here is your optic tract. Now this optic tract will go to the thalamus, to the lateral geniculate body. Now how do you identify a lateral geniculate body on MRI? So let me show you this figure. So it is better seen on coronal images. Now, last time I had shown you the Mickey Mouse like structure or where you see these eyes. These are the red nuclei. This is the midbrain section. So at the level of midbrain, if you take a coronal like here, this is your brainstem. So this area is your pons. This is part of your midbrain. And you see this small bump here. So this is your medial geniculate body, and this is your lateral geniculate body. So optic tracts actually come to this area. And from here, you will have optic radiation getting into the visual cortex, that is the occipital lobe. Now, the part of optic radiation also enters your temporal lobe, which is called as the Mayer's loop. And this is the reason sometimes with the temporal lobe pathologies, you have patients having visual field defects. Even in the patient of epilepsy, when you do temporal lobectomy, you get these visual field defects. Then these optic radiation actually relate into the occipital lobe. Now you all know where exactly the occipital lobe lies, but specifically the primary visual cortex is your calcarine cortex. So how do you identify calcarine cortex on your MR? This is a sagittal or parasagittal image. We all know how to identify the tentorium cerebelli. You will see that there is one sulcus which actually goes from here till the surface of the brain. This is your parieto-occipital sulcus, which separates your parietal lobe anteriorly and the occipital lobe posteriorly. Now there is one more sulcus which forms this lazy Y with this parieto-occipital sulcus. So this is your calcarine sulcus, which is your primary motor cortex. So the area between the parieto-occipital and the calcarine sulcus is your cuneus. Now cuneus gets the fibers from your superior radiation. So it actually sees the inferior quadrant of your vision field, whereas this area here is your lingual gyrus. Now lingual gyrus gets input from your inferior radiation, so it covers your superior field. Now lingual gyrus also has a lot of other function because it is actually continuation of your parahippocampal gyrus from the temporal lobe. This is the gyrus which whenever there is an increase in the cerebral pressure, which herniates into the which causes the transtentorial herniation. So lingual gyrus is the one which herniates. So this is your lingual gyrus. So that was about the visual cortex and visual area. Now coming to the pathologies, one of the common things or amongst pediatric neuropathies, many times they are polyneuropathies. So isolated or mono neuropathy is very less commonly seen, or we get requisition hardly for those cranial neuropathies. But optic nerve is something which is one of the commonest. So how do you define optic neuritis on MR? So whenever you see thickening of nerves along with a hyperintense signal and enhancement, we call it optic neuritis. Now, this is the normal thickness of your nerve that you are supposed to see in a pediatric scan. Now, if you see it here, you realize there is quite a bit of increased thickness, and it's uniform. There is no irregularity to it. If you get irregularity to it, then you should think of glioma. But as long as it is smoothly thickened, it is likely to be an inflammatory etiology. Now, in adult patient, if I get this bilateral optic neuritis, or when the optic neuritis is bilateral and such a long segment neuritis, I really don't have to think about the diagnosis. Most of the times it is NMO associated or NMO spectrum disorder. But in pediatrics, that's not the case, because pediatric patients have got a lot of reasons for getting optic neuritis, and bilateral optic neuritis is quite a common entity, especially when the child's age is less than 10 years. So bilateral affection can be because of the viral causes, or it could be just part of some inflammatory syndrome, or in whether this is a demyelinating, this optic neuritis, whether it's a part of a demyelinating syndrome or just monophasic episode, it becomes really difficult in pediatric patient to comment on that. In adult patient, when I get optic neuritis, I know that this could be the first symptom, and probably 40% of them land up getting MS, multiple sclerosis, on follow-up scans. But in pediatric patient, unless and until, along with the optic neuritis, if the patient has some white matter lesions, especially in the periventricular white matter, only in those cases where they have these lesions, white matter lesions, at the time of optic neuritis, those patients I can confirmatively say that they might be a part of demyelinating syndrome. Otherwise, the first episode of optic neuritis may not be the part of your demyelinating syndromes. Another important thing about optic neuritis is everybody keeps talking about this anti-MOG associated diseases, etc. Whether we can differentiate them from the NMO spectrum disorders. Why the differentiation is important? Because NMO spectrum disorders are actually astrocyte or astrocytopathies, whereas MOG is related to your oligodendropathy. So, there are no imaging-wise differentiation in pediatric patient. Some studies have reported that if you get this papillitis, this protrusion of your optic head along with optic neuritis, that is the involvement of the anterior optic tract, then possibility of it being anti-MOG antibody associated neuropathy is likely. But this is not a hard and fast rule. In NMO spectrum disorders, it's usually the posterior tracts, that is your chiasma and optic tracts, those are more involved. Another specific clinical thing that is seen with anti-MOG optic neuritis is usually these patients have an attack of edema before, and then if the optic neuritis it comes as a second episode, then probably anti-MOG antibody or related disease is more likely. So basically, protrusion of this optic head may not be papillitis always. Sometimes you have this protrusion of the head along with distension of your perioptic sheath, that is the CSF distension. So in such cases where you see this protrusion along with tortuosity of the nerve and distension of this perioptic sheath, then the diagnosis changes. It becomes idiopathic hypertension. In those cases, if you see empty sella, then your diagnosis is almost confirmed. So normally you should see this kind of cupping, or at least the flat appearance of sclera. This is a normal scan. And on axial images, you should be able to see maximum part of your optic nerves. But on axial images, if you start seeing this kinking of the nerve, along with distension of this perioptic CSF space, and with this protrusion of the optic bulb, along with empty sella, then in a post-pubertal girl who is obese and have this repeated episodes of headache, then this becomes a diagnosis. And many times in headache patients, even radiologists miss out on this diagnosis because this tortuosity could be really subtle. What you see is just papilledema and some partially empty sella turcica or sella or completely empty sella. So this was about the tortuosity where the CSF space was increased. Now you get sometimes the tortuosity associated with thickening of the nerve. So the nerve which is thickened and which is very tortuous, and sometimes it may have perioptic CSF spaces which are dilated. So in these cases, you have to rule out possibility of optic gliomas, especially the nerves are really, really thick. Now, this was a classical case of neurofibromatosis 1, where the patient had bilateral optic nerve gliomas. There was involvement of the chiasma as well. Look at the thickness of chiasma. See the mass-like appearance of these nerves. And along with that, this patient also had a GBM-like lesion, that is glioblastoma multiforme-like lesion in the periventricular white matter. So in pediatric patient, this optic nerve gliomas can be sporadic or they can be associated with NF1. If you already know the patient as NF1, it is easy. But if there are no obvious palpable nodules, or if you have not asked the patient, then are there any imaging criteria which can differentiate between these syndromic and sporadic gliomas? Well, there are studies which have described that if you get optic chiasmatic involvement predominantly without optic nerve involvement, then the chances of being it sporadic are very high. Plus, these sporadic gliomas, they distort the anatomy of your optic pathway. Whereas in NF1, though there is a thickening, though there is a mass lesion, they will still preserve the anatomy of your optic pathways. So this is one of the differentiating feature between the two entities. And the cystic changes are supposed to be more common with, if you see a solid cystic mass lesion in the optic chiasma not getting into the optic nerve, it's not that it never gets into the optic nerve, but if it is predominantly chiasmatic with the cystic component, then you should think of sporadic optic glioma, and patient may not be a case of neurocutaneous syndrome. Now, coming to the true cranial nerves, that is your 3rd to 12th nerve. Before we actually get into the anatomy of these cranial nerves, I want you to understand this diagram because it makes things really easy. So each cranial nerve has been divided into multiple parts. So it first starts from the nuclei, which are situated in the brainstem, which is called as the nuclear portion of your cranial nerve. Then it travels to the brainstem, which is your fascicular portion of the cranial nerve. So whenever you have pathologies in this area, they will be picked up on your routine MRI because they are mainly the parenchymal pathology which are affecting the nerve and the fascicular segment. Now from here, when the nerve exits out from your brainstem and it enters the CSF space, this is usually the cisternal space. So we call this as a cisternal segment. Then from the cisternal segment, usually it enters the dura. While entering the dura, it gets some CSF covering along with it. And then it enters your dural venous sinus space. So basically, this is your outer layer of dura. This is your inner layer of dura. Inner layer of dura is adherent to your bone. So in this 2 layers of dura, what you have is a venous blood. So this becomes your intradural portion of the nerve, and then it exits through the foramen into the extraforaminal part, because all these nerves have got different target organs like oculomotor, trochlear, etc. They supply the muscles in the orbit, so they have to move out through the superior orbital fissure. Whereas facial nerve moves out through the stylomastoid foramen, and then they enter their target organs. So all these portions, so nuclear, fascicular, cisternal, then you have intradural, then this is foraminal, and this is extraforaminal component of nerve. Now, most of this nerve will have this segmentation. Now, why it is important to understand this segmentation? Because it makes your choice of sequence easy when you are suspecting a pathology. We will come to that. Now, on that particular basic segmentation pattern, we'll just take an example of one cranial nerve, that is trigeminal nerve, how the nerve travels through these areas and how it is seen on MRI. Now, trigeminal nerve arises from your trigeminal nerve nucleus, which is motor and sensory. It has a fascicular segment which exits out through the pons. Then there is a cisternal segment. Then we have Gazerian ganglion, and the main branches V1, V2, and V3, that is ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular, will come out through this, and then they will have their own organs to be supplied. So on MR, so this is your pontine area or the axial section to the pons. Your nuclei are placed on the dorsal aspect. So this is a motor nucleus, this is slightly lateral will be your sensory nucleus, and you will have this fascicular segment going like this. That is your fascicular segment. So this will be better seen on your T2 weighted images, or if you're suspecting an infarct, then your DWI images are important for that. Then as it comes out, this becomes your cisternal segment. So this is best seen on your drive images because CSF is bright and there is a high contrast between the nerve and the CSF. Then here it enters the dura, which is the area of Meckel's cave. So we keep talking about Meckel's cave, schwannoma, etc. So this is the Meckel's cave area where lies your Gazerian ganglia of trigeminal nerve. Now, after this, the nerve, two branches of the nerve, that is your ophthalmic and maxillary, they enter cavernous sinus. So cavernous, this area is your pituitary area. So the cavernous sinus just lie beside that. So they enter the cavernous area, but you will not be able to see this on drive sequence because the cavernous sinus, the blood will also look dark on the sequence. So you need something which will opacify your cavernous sinus. And to look for pathology in this region, you need to give contrast to the patient. So here comes the role of your contrast. So this is your pituitary stalk, that is your pituitary gland, and on either side, these are your cavernous sinuses. If you see these gray structures here, these are actually the nerves that you are seeing in the cavernous sinus. That is oculomotor, trochlear. Then this is the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal, and this is the maxillary division of your trigeminal. On this sequence, you will not see the ICA, that is the cavernous portion of the internal carotid artery, and the sixth nerve will lie just lateral to this. So lateral and inferior to this. So this is how you will see the intradural segments of your cranial nerve. Now, once they enter the cavernous sinus, they have to exit out through the cavernous sinus, and then they will enter their foraminal portions. So the ophthalmic division will get out through the superior orbital fissures. How to identify superior orbital fissure? We'll see it along with the third, fourth, sixth nerve. The maxillary division will come out through the foramen rotundum. Now, foramen rotundum lies along the lateral wall of your sphenoid sinus. This area is your sphenoid sinus. So along the lateral wall, you will see the foramen rotundum. So maxillary division will actually pass through this. And the mandibular division, this is your skull base. So you see this defect here. So this is your foramen oval. So foramen oval is best seen on your coronal images, and the mandibular division will come out through this. Now, many times there are pathologies in the bone which catches the nerve. So in those particular cases, you need to do CT of these patients because the bony part is better seen on CT than on MRI. So this is foramen rotundum where you have maxillary division, and this is foramen oval where you have your mandibular division of the cranial nerves. Now, once they are out through the foramen, this is the foraminal part of the nerve. Then they have their own target organs. Like a mandibular division is actually your motor division. So it supplies the muscles of mastications, and these are the area of, so these are the structures, muscles of mastication, that is masseter and pterygoids. So depending on the target organ, you have to know which areas to be imaged. Now, let's come to the protocols. So as I told you, each nerve is divided into multiple parts. So for the nuclear part evaluation and for your fascicular part, you need routine brain sequences. So like if you miss out on the diffusion weighted images, and if the patient, now this particular case, this is in the region of midbrain. So we are having a restricted diffusion in this area. This is the area of your oculomotor nerve nuclei. So if there is an infarct here, and if you do not see this sequence, even if you see rest of the course of the nerve, you are going to miss out the finding. This is a small infarct which has actually caused you the oculomotor nerve palsy, but that will be missed. 3D flare sequence is useful because it grabs your attention. Whatever is generally the pathology looks hyper intense on 3D flare images, and it is easy to pick up the pathology on this sequence. So I usually prefer 3D flare images whenever there is a cranial nerve imaging case, because that makes my life easy. Even the thinnest nerve can be well seen on this sequence. Then 3D drive images is basically for the cysternal part of your segment. Then 3D or 2D post-contrast T1 weighted fat saturated sequences are basically for the intradural segments of your nerves, because they will opacify the blood and the nerves will stand out as gray structures. For the foraminal part, you will require sometimes CT. So CT will show you the kind of bone destruction that is happening along with the lesion. If there is a remodeling and if there is expansion of that particular foramen here in this area, then I know that there is some slow growing pathology which has caused the remodeling of the bone. But if I see something destroyed here, which looks like a permeative kind of destruction, then I know that there is some aggressive lesion that is happening in this area and probably catching up the nerve. So, and this is about the role of limited CT sections on cranial nerve imaging. Then, depending on the target organ, you will have to change the protocol. Like, for example, third, fourth, and sixth cranial nerves, you know that extraocular muscles are being evaluated. So you have to cover the orbits entirely on both axial and coronal planes and in different sequences. Sometimes, suppose if there is a trochlear nerve palsy, so trochlear nerve supplies your superior oblique muscle. So this is the superior oblique muscle, okay? So if you get atrophy in this area, or if you get altered signal in this area, I know that I'm trying to look at the trochlear nerve in a case of diplopia, okay? So this is how sometimes the target organ help you to detect the pathology or to suspect the pathology, which area you are supposed to look at. Okay, now this is basically for the radiologist. So all these different kinds of nerves will have different protocols, and these are the anatomical consideration a radiologist has to consider while doing the scan. Okay, now coming to the nerves. So this is actually, you have to remember this. These are the n number of nuclei that you get with cranial nerves. You really don't have to remember this, but what I want you to remember is this. From which area of the brain you are getting the nerves. This portion here is your midbrain. So from midbrain, anteriorly you get the oculomotor, and from the posterior surface of midbrain you get the trochlear nerve. The bulkiest portion, or the pregnant belly of pons. So from the pons, the major nerve that comes is your trigeminal nerve. And the sixth nerve, that is the abducens nerve, will come from the anterior aspect, but at the pontomedullary junction. And from the lateral aspect, you will have your seventh and eighth nerve, that is the facial and vestibulocochlear nerves. Whereas from the medulla, you have your 9th, 10th, this is 11th, and this is 12th nerve. So 9th, 10th, and 11th will come from the posterior aspect, whereas the 12th nerve will actually come from the little anterolateral aspect. So remember this: 3rd, 4th from midbrain, 5th from the pons, 6th and 7th and 8th from the pontomedullary junction, and 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th are from the medulla. Okay, so now let's see 3rd, 4th, and 6th nerves. Coming to the nuclei, so the 3rd and the 4th nerve nuclei lie. So this is basically the sagittal section of your brainstem. Remember this section. So I'll just give you the anatomy. So this portion is your midbrain, and here is the superior collicles, here is your inferior colliculus. So the 3rd nerve nuclei are at the level of your superior colliculus, and the 4th nerve nucleus is at the level of your inferior colliculus. Whereas abducens nerve nucleus is in the pons, it is along the floor of your 4th ventricle. So these are the nuclei of 3rd, 4th, and 6th nerves. Coming to the oculomotor nerve. Now, this is at the level of midbrain. Okay, the Mickey Mouse face. These red structures here are your red nuclei. Now, this white structure here is actually your cerebral aqueduct. So, oculomotor nerve nuclei lie just anterior to your cerebral aqueduct. This is a motor nucleus. It also has parasympathetic nucleus, that is Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which supply the parasympathetic nerve to your ciliary muscles or for pupillary construction. Now, the fibers of the oculomotor nerve will travel through the red nucleus, and they actually come out from the medial aspect of, now I couldn't show it here, but they actually come out from the medial aspect of your cerebral peduncle. So this area here is your interpeduncular fossa. So you will see cranial nerve, oculomotor nerve coming anteriorly from your medial aspect of your cerebral peduncle. So this is the cisternal segment of your oculomotor nerve on either side. Now, you must have heard it or read it n number of times that the PCOM aneurysm causes oculomotor nerve palsy, etc. So where exactly it causes compression of the oculomotor nerve? So, well, this structure here is your posterior cerebellar artery. So in the cisterns, you have vessels and you have nerves. So if I show it on coronal, now all these dots here, I'll just modify these areas. Now this is just one section. Actually, the vessels travel in multiple sections. So I'll just modify that section for you. So this portion here, it's suppose basilar artery, you will have a posterior cerebral artery going up and the superior cerebral artery will be below it. And the structure that lies here is your oculomotor nerve. So your oculomotor nerve is actually sitting between your PCA and SCA. So any aneurysm arising from this or this is likely to cause oculomotor nerve compression. There is one more important anatomical structure here, that is the uncus of your medial temporal lobe. So whenever we have this raised intracranial pressure, there is uncal herniation, and because the uncus is in so much close relation to the oculomotor nerve, it causes compression of the oculomotor nerve, and that's why you get oculomotor nerve palsy in patients with raised intracranial pressures. So that is the indication of your ankle herniation. Okay, so this was the cisternal part of the nerve. Now, coming to the nuclear and cisternal segment of your trochlear nerve. So at the level of superior colliculus, you had oculomotor nerves. At the level of inferior colliculus, you will have trochlear nuclei. Now, trochlear nerve is a pure motor nerve. So it just has pure motor nuclei. Now, in the oculomotor nerve or all other nerves, they have ipsilateral supply, right? But in oculomotor nerve, this trochlear nerve, the fibers actually cross to opposite side and they form the fibers of your opposite trochlear nerve. Whereas the right trochlear nerve will get fibers from your left trochlear nuclei. Now, what is the significance of this? If you have a infarct or lesion in this area, you are likely to get a contralateral nerve palsy. So that is the importance of trochlear nerve. Now, trochlear nerve is the only nerve which actually goes from the posterior aspect of the brainstem. Otherwise, rest of the all nerves are from the anterior aspect. Now, since it goes from the posterior aspect, it has got the longest cisternal segment. And that's why this is the nerve which is prone for trauma. Then other thing that makes it prone for trauma, it's its relation with the tentorium cerebelli. Now, this area here is the tentorium cerebelli. So your trochlear nerve actually travels from here, it goes into this cistern, and then along the tentorium cerebelli, it enters your cavernous sinus, that is its intradural segment. So because of any mass effect or even trauma, and the trochlear nerve being very thinnest nerve, it is very prone for your trauma and also the barotrauma. In fact, many patients sometimes complain that after the air flight, they have got this trochlear nerve palsy. So it is because of the barotrauma, the trochlear nerve gets damaged. So it is that kind of a tender nerve. Most of the times, even in thinnest of images, we may not be able to see trochlear nerve very clearly, but what you have to know is the path of the trochlear nerve. So if there is any lesion in a trochlear nerve, along the path of the trochlear nerve, then it is an indirect evidence that probably this is the one which is causing the pressure, or this is probably along the trochlear nerve. That's why it is a trochlear nerve schwannoma or some lesion related to that. So this is the importance of knowing the anatomy of a particular nerve. Now, coming to the abducens nerve. Abducens nerve, third and fourth were in midbrain. Abducens nerve nucleus will lie in the pons. There is an important anatomical landmark that you see on pons, especially axial images, is now in this particular image, it is not clearly seen, but what you see is this bumpy structure here. So these bumps are called as the facial colliculus. Why they are called as facial colliculus, I'll tell you while explaining the facial nerve course. So the nuclei here are the abducens nerve nuclei, and the fibers that run anteriorly and slightly inferiorly to exit through the pontomedullary junction. So this is on axial images. So this tiny structure here is actually your abducens nerve. This tiny structure here going anteroposterior is your abducens nerve. It is better seen on your sagittal images. So this structure here coming from this is pons, this is medulla. So pontomedullary junction is your abducens nerve. From here, the abducens nerve will actually enter the dura. This area here is called as the Dolorous canal. So if you have a lesion along the Dolorous canal, it will cause mass effect on your abducens nerve, and the patient will have an abducens nerve palsy. So, and from here, Dolorous canal, it will enter the dura, which is the cavernous sinus segment of your abducens nerve. Now, all these third, fourth, and sixth nerve have nuclear and cysternal components which are like separate, but they have a common course through the cavernous sinus and superior orbital fissures to reach the orbit. So coming to the intradural and foraminal segments of these nerves. So for intradural course, the knowing anatomy of the cavernous sinus is essential. So cavernous sinuses form the lateral wall of your pituitary gland. So cavernous sinuses are usually symmetrical, and the nerves are along the lateral wall of your cavernous sinuses. So third, fourth, ophthalmic division, and maxillary division. Your mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve does not enter your cavernous sinus. It directly goes through the foramen oval into the temporal, into the neck spaces or skull base. And the sixth nerve lies here along the inferolateral aspect of your ICA. So that's why whenever there is a pathology of the ICA, the abducens nerve is the one who first gets sacrificed. And this is the bony anatomy or landmark of your superior orbital fissure. We will come to this later. So coming to the cavernous sinus, this is your MR image. Now this portion is your optic chiasma. Here somewhere will lie your infundibular stalk or pituitary stalk. This gland here is pituitary gland. This structure here is your ICA, that is the cavernous portion of your ICA. On plain scans, you will not see the cranial nerves. You have to opacify the cavernous sinus to see the cranial nerves. The important thing to pick up a small pathology in this area is to see the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. Normally, either it is straight or it has got a concave appearance. The moment you start seeing it as slightly bulging, focal bulge somewhere here or here, you should suspect that there is some small inflammatory tissue which is being there in the cavernous sinus, and probably that is causing the nerve palsy. So it is an important area when you are assessing the third, fourth, and sixth nerves. On axial images, these are your cavernous ICAs, which will look as a flow void or loss of signal. And this is your lateral mark of your cavernous sinus. Now, this is a pathological image. I have kept it purposely. So if you see the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus here, you see it is quite nice. But if you see it here, you see slight bulge happening here. Now, this area could be a pathological area, and if you see enhancement in this area on post-contrast study, then you know that probably there is a lesion in this area. So on post-contrast study, you actually opacify the cavernous sinus and try to see any pathology in this area. Blood shows the maximum enhancement. So except for hemangioma, rest of the pathologies will be slightly less enhancing than the blood in this region. Okay. Now coming to the superior orbital fissure, it is important to identify on axial images the superior orbital fissure. If you see the normal skull anatomy, this is your optic canal and this is your superior orbital fissure. So optic canal is superior and medial to your superior orbital fissure. The same is with the on MR that you can see. Now here in this area, as I told you before, that this is the wall of the sphenoid sinus, and this is your clinoid process. So between this is your intracanalicular segment of optic nerve. Slightly below, anterolateral to it, this foramen here is your superior orbital fissure. So if you go a section below, you will see it nicely getting into the orbit. So this is better, the bony margins of it are better seen on CT images, whereas the soft tissue component of it is better seen on the MR images. So here, this area here is the superior orbital fissure. So if we cut it here, then this is the area that we get. So this blob here is your optic canal, and this portion here is your superior orbital fissure. It is better seen on your pre-contrast Stephen-Metted images where you do not saturate the fat, because this fat signal will make you see all these gray structures, which are your normal nerve structures that pass through the superior orbital fissure. The moment you start seeing obliteration of this fat, then you know that you're looking at some pathology. So if you want to pick up subtle pathologies, these are the sequences that you are supposed to take in a patient with a suspected third, fourth, or sixth nerve palsy. Now coming to the extraforaminal course, we all know that trochlear and the abducens nerve are the pure motor nerves. So SO4, LR6. SO4 is superior oblique supplied by 4, lateral rectus supplied by 6. So this is your lateral rectus. By the position, you can make it out. And superior oblique lies here. So this is supplied by your 4th nerve. This is by 6th nerve. The rest of the muscles, superior, medial, and lateral rectus, will be supplied by your 3rd nerve. This fat is your retroorbital fat. So whenever there is a lesion in the orbit, it is better seen on the pre-contrast images because you will see obliteration of the fat in this area. Whereas whenever there is an inflammation, you will better see it on T2 weighted images where the fat is suppressed, and you will see them as white lining or white stranding in the periorbital region. Then you know that this is probably some inflammatory pathology that is going on. Now, coming to the cases, this is just a representative case. In adult patient, we get a lot of abducens nerve palsies or a lot of third, fourth cranial nerve patients who come for evaluation. But in pediatric patient, usually whenever there is a cranial nerve evaluation, most of the times we have seen that the brainstem gliomas who present as a 6th nerve cranial palsy, or sometimes oculomotor nerve palsy, or sometimes lower cranial nerve palsies. If I see on routine brain images this parenchymal affection, then I don't get into the protocol of the cranial nerves. This will be treated as tumor, and the tumor protocol will be followed. But this is one of the common lesions that we see in pediatric patients. But sometimes the diagnosis is not that clear, or the pathology is not really staring at you like in this case. In those cases, you have to actually go segment by segment and see every portion of the nerve. Now, this was a patient who, this is a recent patient, post-COVID patient, who presented with a right third nerve palsy. Now, if you look at, there is nothing really that picks up your attention or that grabs your attention. So in such cases, you go segment by segment. So see in the parenchyma, in the nuclear segment, if you're seeing any pathology. So on all sequences, it looks pretty okay. There is no infarct, there is no focal lesion or demyelinating plaque that I am seeing. In the cisternal segment, there is, now I have not shown all the images, but there was no compression of the nerve, or there is no obvious thickening or focal abnormality along this segment of the nerve. When it entered the cavernous sinus. Now, if you look at the cavernous sinus, see this area here and see this area here, you will see that there is difference between the thickness of this cavernous sinuses in its anterior portion. So this could be one of the abnormal area I should be looking at on post-contrast scan. So this segment looks abnormal. If you go down into the superior orbital fissure region, see the clean area here and see this portion here. So this is your optic nerve. So this area looks abnormal. Now, so I need to see this area on post-contrast images. Now, when I come into the orbit, now this is on coronal images. See the concave lateral border of the cavernous sinus on the left side, but on the right side, there is definitely some thickening which is happening in this area. So I need to evaluate it properly on post-contrast images. Now, when I do post-contrast imaging, so just to show you the extraforaminal component or segment of the disease. So on this side, everything looks okay, but this portion has started thickening, looking abnormal. This looks quite thick. As I come anteriorly, sorry. So as I come anteriorly, you will see some thickening in this area. This is thickened. This is actually going to the muscle. So this is supplying your medial rectus muscle. And when we do contrast in this patient, so the area which was looking abnormal like this is actually showing enhancement. So this was the cavernous and the superior orbital and intraorbital segment of the oculomotor nerve, which was thickened and enhancing. And apparently in COVID patients, you get this as a demyelinating neuropathy, like your Miller-Fisher syndrome. So this was a case of that. So important is this importance of sequence and knowing the anatomy so that you can go and assess every scan as per the anatomy. Okay, now coming to the seventh nerve. Are we all together or I'm just talking to myself?
We are very much there, Hikeshwari.
Okay, so I hope this wasn't too complex.
No, I think everybody is fine till now.
Okay, so because sometimes it really gets tiring and taxing to talk about all cranial nerves in one go.
Yeah, I think after 7th, then we can just take a poll with whether everybody wants, or
I
we
think
can take it as the next.
Yeah, so I can just show the anatomy where you are supposed to see the 9th, and I will not get into the details.
Fine.
Okay, yeah. So 7th nerve is the facial nerve. The facial nerve, till now, olfactory and optic were pure sensory nerves. 3rd, 4th, 6th were pure motor except for oculomotor, which had got some parasympathetic supply. But facial nerve has got multiple components. It has got a motor component which supply your muscles of facial expression. Then it has got a sensory component which carries sensation from the pin of your ear. And then it has got a parasympathetic component which supply your lacrimal gland, nasal mucosa, submandibular gland, and sublingual gland. So there are a lot of components that facial nerve has. So, and facial nerve is quite a long nerve with different branches. So localization of pathology depends on which all function have been compromised. So let's see. So the facial nerve has been divided into so many segments, 7 segments almost. So this is just to show you the normal anatomy, how the facial nerve goes. So this is a nuclear portion which will be in the brainstem at the level of pons. Then you will have a fascicular component which will go through the pons, and then it will exit at the cerebellopontine angle. So whenever you have a pathology in this area, you are likely, it is likely to either compress the 7th-8th nerve complex, or it is likely to be arising from the 7th-8th nerve complexes. So this is the cysternal segment of your 7th nerve. And when it enters the porus acousticus, so porus acousticus is this portion. So this is the entry of your internal auditory canal. Internal auditory canal is a bony canal. So the facial nerve along with the 7th-8th nerve will enter the internal auditory canal. Then it will turn into the labyrinthine segment. And here it is the geniculate fossa. So from geniculate fossa, it will turn posteriorly and lie into the middle ear cavity, and then it will come down. So this is on the axial images. If I have to show it on the sagittal images, this is your geniculate fossa. From the geniculate fossa, the nerve will actually turn into the tympanic cavity, which will be below your lateral semicircular canal, and then it will turn down into the mastoid segment to enter the parotid gland. And in the parotid gland, it will give rise to your muscles of facial expression, etc. Here, there are important branches. We'll see to it, we'll see how we see it on imaging. So the nuclear and fascicular segment, there are 4 types of nuclei that a facial nerve can have. Is motor nucleus. So motor nucleus fibers actually go around your abducens nucleus, and that's why they form a bump here, and that's why it is called as the facial calculus. So it is one of the landmark to identify the area of your abducens nerve. These fibers will travel, get into the cerebellopontine system, and then into the internal auditory canal. So this is the cisternal segment of the, or intracanaliculaar segment of the nerves. So from the, now the trigeminal nerves were from the anterior aspects like this, like opened out arms, whereas the 7th, 8th nerve complexes will come little laterally, or posterolaterally rather. So this portion here is your cerebellopontine cistern, pons, and then this is the cerebellum. So cerebellopontine cistern. When they get into the internal auditory canal, so here, this portion. So there are 4 nerves. There are actually 3 nerves, basically facial nerve, vestibular nerve, and cochlear nerve. But vestibular nerve is divided into superior and inferior division. So in the, if you cut this section like this, you will get a view like this. So these are the 4 nerves. So the anteriorly and superiorly is your facial nerve, below is your cochlear nerve, and posteriorly will be your superior vestibular and inferior vestibular. So how will you remember it? This is from the first year anatomy. This is 7 up and coke down. 7 up is your 7th nerve. This is the cochlear nerve, and the posteriorly are going to be your superior and inferior nerves. It is mainly this association and this relationship is important mainly for the cochlear anomalies that you get, or vestibular anomalies that you get in patients with hearing loss. So they actually look at the diameters of this nerve. Cochlear nerve should be equal to or slightly more than the facial nerve. If the cochlear nerve is smaller than the facial nerve, then the chances of that patient has a cochlear nerve atrophy or cochlear nerve hypoplasia are high, and these patients do prognostically do not do so well, in which the cochlear nerve is of normal caliber. So this is how you remember. Then this is the case just to show you. This is a Mobius syndrome. Basically, on axial images, you see this facial nerve getting between the cochlea and the vestibule. On this side, you just see one nerve. Here you are seeing 2 nerves in the superior section, but here you are just seeing one nerve. And when you see the left side, you have these 4 dots coming in, so which is a normal configuration in the internal auditory canal. But here in this area, this dot is missing. So basically facial nerve was absent in this particular case. And this patient also had absent 6th. So this is a 6th nerve, that is abducens nerve, what we saw, which was from the anterior aspect. And on this side, the abducens nerve was missing. So this was a case of Mobius syndrome, where you get congenital aplasia of your 7th and 6th nerve. This can be associated with a lot of other anomalies, but so you have to screen rest of the brain to look for the abnormalities. So this was about the cisternal segment or intracanalicular segment of the facial nerve. Now, once from the intracanalicular segment, actually the facial nerve turns into the labyrinth. Labyrinth is a bony part. So it is better seen on CT than MR. So this portion here is called as the labyrinthine segment. And this area, the bulbous area here, is your geniculate ganglia. This is the important area because from here you will have greater and lesser petrosal nerve coming out, which are the parasympathetic supply of your facial nerve. So if you have a lesion which is anterior to this portion, you will have the loss of all functions like parasympathetic as well as sensory and motor functions. But if you have a lesion distal to this area, then this would be preserved. So the lacrimation of your lacrimation will be preserved. So you know that the patient has preserved lacrimation, then you are looking at a pathology which is distal to it and not proximal to it. So this is your labyrinthine segment. Then coming to your tympanic segment. So tympanic segment is basically this segment which goes posteriorly like this. So tympanic segment will be seen as this line here on the temporal images. If you see the coronal, so this is your middle ear cavity. Here you are seeing the ossicles. So the tympanic the segment of facial nerve is just here, very close proximity to your middle ear cavity. So in pediatric patient, whenever you get otitis media, those patients may develop facial neuritis and can have palsy, which is one of the common cause of facial nerve palsy in pediatric patients. So this is because of this tympanic segment, which is so much in close proximity to your middle ear cavity. Then from here, this is the geniculate fossa. I have already talked about it. This is normally little bulbous and you should not confuse it with the pathology. From the tympanic segment, so this was the tympanic component, then it comes down. This is called as the mastoid segment of your tympanic nerve or facial nerve. Here it gives a rise to the stapedius muscle. This muscle here, if there is a damage to the nerve at this point, then this muscle is preserved. If the injury is proximal to it, then this muscle is gone and the patient present with hyperacusis. So when the patient complains of hyperacusis with preserved lacrimation, then you know that the pathology is in this segment somewhere between the geniculate fossa and the nerve to the stapedius. As you come down, then it gives the chorda tympani branch, which supplies which carries the taste sensation from your anterior two-thirds of the tongue. So now this is very hypothetical, because this is a very short segment. So preservation of this, but loss of sensation, this means the abnormalities in this area. Usually it happens with the trauma when the fracture somehow manages to just go between the two branches of the nerve. And then the nerve comes out through the stylomastoid foramen. So on actual images, you will actually see this as a small tiny dot, and I don't expect you to know where exactly that facial recess is. But what I want you to remember is between the mastoid and your middle ear cavity, somewhere this is the facial area that you should be aware of. So these are the foraminal sections. As you come down, you will see the mastoid, and this is a styloid process. So this foramen here is called as a stylomastoid foramen. We'll just skip this reconstruction. We have already talked about this. Now, when it comes into the parotid gland, it divides into 5 branches. Now, these branches will not be seen on images. The facial nerve sometimes can be seen on images if it is inflamed or if it is affected by some tumor. And in that particular area, so the facial nerve plane is usually lateral to your retromandibular vein. So whenever you give contrast, you can opacify the retromandibular vein, and the facial nerve is lateral to it. So this is the landmark to divide your superficial and deep lobe of the parotid. So pathologies in this area, for the surgeon, they are more important than for the neurologist. As a radiologist, this is an important thing for me, because while assessment of the facial nerve, if I do not involve this area, the chance that sometimes I can miss out on the pathologies, because the lesion can be just in the parotid gland, and if I do not cover the parotid gland as a part of the protocol, then this will be missed. So this was a case of actually tumor of the parotid, which had a perineural spread along the facial nerve, but if we had not covered this area, then this would probably have been missed, and patient wouldn't have got his diagnosis. So this was about the facial nerve. Now, before ending the facial nerve talk, I want you to understand the normal and abnormal enhancement patterns in facial nerve. Normally, whenever we see a nerve enhancing or asymmetrically enhancing as compared to its contralateral part, or whenever we see enhancement in the nerve, we usually call it an inflammation or some pathology in that area. But facial nerve is the one where you can normally have an enhancing component. So which are the enhancing component? Those are normal, and which are the enhancing component should be considered as abnormal. So normally, the intraparenchymal part, that is your nuclear, fascicular, the cisternal component, and even the intracanalicular component and the labyrinthine component of the facial nerve should not enhance normally. So intracranial part, which you see on MR images, should not be normally enhancing. And if you see enhancement in any of these areas, it is usually pathological. Geniculate ganglia routinely enhances, even the tympanic segment of the facial nerve enhances, plus the mastoid segment that we saw on coronal images, that shows enhancement. And these are normal kind of enhancement. If you see enhancement in these areas, you should not consider it abnormal, unless and until if you see it asymmetrically thickened and more enhancing as compared to the contralateral side. So for example, now this, if you look at the right side, there is no enhancement in any of these segments, right? But on the left side, you are seeing some enhancement in the intracanalicular portion of the nerve. So this enhancement is abnormal. And this is a typical site of enhancement that you get in patients with Bell's palsy. So when you see such kind of enhancement along any of the tract of the facial nerve, you should think of the pathology, and depending on the characterization of the lesion, you have to come to a diagnosis. But this is the classical example of your Bell's palsy. Now, along with the facial nerve, the facial nerve is superior and anterior. So along with the facial nerve, if you get enhancement of your 7th-8th nerve complex, then it is Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. When you see such kind of enhancement, always look at the pinna of that patient. So you will see some thickening of pinna or some enhancement or some inflammatory swelling in this area. So even without looking at the patient, sometimes on MR, we get this diagnosis. Look at the pinna on this side and look at the pinna on this side. So there is definitely thickening and some inflammatory markers in this region. So this is a case of Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. Okay, so I am done till 7th nerve. Do you guys interested in rest of the nerves, or should we just stop here?
So how much time is left, Yogeshwari, if we want to cover everything then?
It becomes really difficult. Only thing I can show is anyways, vestibulocochlear anatomical localization I have shown. So I'll skip the vestibulocochlear nerve part. I will not show the pathways and etc. We'll just show the pathologies of vestibulocochlear nerve, and then I'll show you the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. Is that okay, or is it too late for everybody?
Fine. I think 10-15 minutes it should be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. Go ahead then. Yeah.
Okay, so vestibulocochlear nerve these are the only nerves which have got only intracranial course. There is no extracranial or extraforaminal course, and these are pure sensory nerves, right? So cochlear nerve, now this structure here, like a cauliflower like structure here, is your cochlea, and posteriorly is your vestibule. So the nerve which arises from the cochlea is your cochlear nerve, and this is vestibular nerve. So they get input from these areas. So if you are not finding any pathology along the nerve tracts, so common pathology that we see are vestibular cochlear schwannomas, etc. But if you do not see this, always try to look at the signal in the cochlea and vestibule, especially in children. Normally, it should look like CSF. When you get dampening of the signal, this could be one of the indication for either labyrinthitis. In that case, when you do the contrast study, you will see enhancement of these areas. And when you see enhancement, so this could be just labyrinthitis in a patient patient who presented with imbalance, etc. Or sometimes in pediatric patient when they have episode of meningitis or some past history of meningitis, and you do MR in those patients, and if you see dark signal in this area, you should always do CT and check if you are seeing ossification in this area or the bone getting whitened out in this area. So in that case, the diagnosis become your labyrinthitis ossificans. So this is a classical ice cream cone appearance of vestibular schwannoma that you get. So you will see a lesion in the cerebellopontine angle and then getting into the IAC. So this ice cream cone is typical appearance of your vestibular schwannoma. But many times the typical lesion or the big lesion may not be there. We have seen vestibular schwannomas like only in this area. This is a small 5 by 6 millimeter size lesion, etc. So the protocol has to be right in those patients. And sometimes if you have vestibular schwannoma, then this is a typical example to show multiple cranial nerve schwannomas. Now, as I have already talked to you about the anatomy of trigeminal and oculomotor nerve, this is at the level of midbrain, and you are seeing the lesion along the right oculomotor nerve. This is at the level of pons, and you are seeing the lesion along your trigeminal nerve, so and vestibular cochlear schwannoma. So this is a case of NF2. So whenever we see schwannoma along any cranial nerve, I like to see all the cranial nerves and also the brain to look for small meningiomas or small schwannomas, which may make the diagnosis of NF2 for us. Sometimes it could be just a small infarct in the vestibulocochlear nucleus region, which patient presents with the imbalance and multiple episodes of vomiting, and a small lesion like this can give rise to symptoms. So this was about vestibulocochlear nerve. Now coming to the 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th nerves, we will see these nerves together, and we will see only intracranial portions of this nerve, because these nerves actually have such a long extracranial component. So vagus nerve almost goes to your splenic flexure. The glossopharyngeal nerve is still your pharyngeal muscles. The hypoglossal nerve supplies your tongue, etc. And the spinal accessory nerves supplies your trapezius and sternocleidomastoid. So we will not get into this part. How do you identify these nerves? So basically, you are going to see these nerve at the level of medulla. So in the medulla, you have pyramids, then you have inferior olivary nucleus, and then this is the posterior portion of the nerve. So your 9th, 10th, and 11th nerve, they actually arise here, little posterior laterally, along the posterior to your olivary sulcus. This is an important thing because this is how you will differentiate between 9th, 10th nerve and the 12th nerve. So the 9th, 10th, 11th nerve, thankfully on imaging, you cannot separate them from each other, and you cannot really differentiate between the 9th, 10th and 11th nerve pathology. So whenever you have a lesion along these areas, we usually try to call it as the lesion is seen along the 9th, 10th, 11th complex, because we really cannot differentiate between these segments. Now from here, from the cisternal segment, it enters the jugular foramen. So jugular foramen has got actually two parts. We will come to that later. First, after this, we will see the 12th nerve. So 12th nerve, the way we had in the pons, those facial colliculus, the similar bumps you will see in the medulla, and this is the area of your hypoglossal nerve nuclei. And hypoglossal nerves will actually come like this, and this is the pyramid, and this is the olive. So hypoglossal nerve will come anterior to your olive. So pre-olivary will be hypoglossal, and post-olivary here will be your 9th, 10th, 11th complex. So this is about the cisternal segment of these nerves. So here, this will be the 9th, 10th, 11th nerves, and here anteriorly is going to be your hypoglossal nerve. So this is just an important anatomical consideration that you have to remember. Foraminal component, so 9th, 10th, 11th nerve will get into the jugular fossa. So this canal here is the carotid canal. Posterior to that is your jugular fossa, which has got the two parts, pars nervosa and pars vasculosa. From here will go the 9th nerve, and here will go your 10th and 11th nerve. You cannot really see these nerves clearly unless and until you do really high resolution images. We generally don't do them in routine cases. Many times, whenever there is a skull-based pathology, it involves these nerves, and individual affection of nerves in this particular area is very rare. I have yet to see, unless and until there is a schwannoma or peripheral nerve sheath tumor that you see in this area. Otherwise, it is difficult to differentiate it from each other. Whereas the hypoglossal nerve will go through the hypoglossal canal, and hypoglossal canal will be like this anteriorly. So if you see it on coronal images, this is an easy image to remember. You have to get to the section of your IACs. These are the internal auditory canals. Just below that, you will see these areas. So these are your jugular foramens. If you see this structure, it looks like a beak of an eagle. So this is the jugular tubercle. So the foramen that is above it is your jugular foramen, and foramen that is below it is your hypoglossal foramen. So basically here will be 7th, 8th nerves, 9th, 10th, 11th, and this will be the 12th nerve. So when you see it on coronal, you can see better that from exactly which area is the pathology arising. So in one glance, if you have to see, these are 7th, 8th nerves, these are 9th, 10th, 11th nerves, and here is your hypoglossal nerve. So try to identify this eagle. So the beak of the eagle, above it will be your jugular, and below it will be your hypoglossal nerve. So this just helps in localizing pathology like this. So this is the eagle on this side, and this is so basically the jugular tubercle has gone. The maximum lesion is actually coming from the jugular fossa and then getting down. Small portion of it has actually protruded into the hypoglossal canal, but the majority lesion is along the jugular fossa. This was a case of vagal schwannoma. And from here, actually the nerves enter into the carotid space. So we will not get into this because this becomes the part of your head, neck, or radiology. So that's about the nerves. I hope I had made it a little easier for you guys. At least next time you'll be able to identify these nerves by yourself.
Yogeshwari, that was excellent. I think I'll ask Jitangi to give a brief comment, and in interest of time, as we are getting late, probably we may not take any questions. So over to you, Jitangi. Jitangi, are you there?
Sorry, I have muted myself.
Okay.
So thank you, Kavita, and also thank you very much, Yogeshwari. I think that was an excellent outline. It was no easy task because you had so much to cover. And I think the broad areas that you outlined was like you gave a very clear outline of the anatomy and you took each cranial nerve, and also I think your initial introduction into the different components made it very easy for us to follow, and how each segment of those would be seen in different sequences. That was extremely important for us to follow the course of the nerve so that we could identify the normal anatomy. And then of course you liaised it with the different sequences, so which means for the radiology trainees as well as even for us, the importance of identifying which sequence is actually important for localizing each particular nerve. And I think you try to show, like you went through so many aspects, but you described the pathology in different situations. For example, in congenital hyperplasia, and also like the different demyelinating syndromes, the appearance in tumors, and NF was one of the other pathologies. Like so many different varieties of appearances, taking examples of clinical conditions. And I think all in all, this was within a short time, you went through so much. And I think we are very grateful to you. And I'm sure this would be available on the web so that, if anybody wants to go back and have a look, things would be more, you might be able to recap more and then listen to you again, so that we are very clear of the wide extent that you covered. So thank you very much once again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, the cranial nerves are really difficult, and there is much more than this that is there for cranial nerves, but it is really difficult to put in that much amount of information in such a small time so it gets little dragging at the end of the day. Even as a speaker, I feel, "Arey yaar, khatam hi nahi ho raha hai."
So Yogeshwari, it was, I think already we are getting a lot of thank you and congratulatory messages. And of course, it's a daunting task to, include so many cranial nerves, and so much efforts you have put into your presentation. That was really commendable. So I think there are not many questions, and in interest of time also, I think you also have to get back to your home. So thank you so much, Yogeshwari. And to all the participants, I want to say that this talk is going to be available on the AOCN website. So everybody can access it, because this is really too much of information for us also to grasp and retain it. So, but Yogeshwari, you've done a very brilliant job. I think you've used so many animations and everything to make it as clear, like as if, teaching a toddler, because we are really toddlers in this cranial nerve imaging. So
Thank
I think
you so much,
thank you very much. And we may trouble you later if we have another season. And we are having 2 more talks in this season, which is the last season, the third one, the third season. So stay tuned on 6th and 7th. We are having 1 more neuroimaging related talk on 7th. And before that, we are having another talk on 6th. So please stay tuned for the next 2 talks on 6th and 7th also. So till then, good night. Thank you, Jitangi, for joining us. And thank you all the participants, even though it was a little late today. Everybody is still sticking around. And so a very good night to all of you. So yeah, good night. Bye.
Yeah, bye everybody.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you, Yogeshwari. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.